questions later on, but if as I'm talking, especially because it's such a small group, you want to just say, can you explain? Please feel free to interrupt me, okay? So what I wanted to do was I've changed things around a bit because I gather that your focus is upon sort of, strategy and leadership. I didn't just want to focus on a biography of Churchill's life, interesting though I think that is. So I'm going to try and focus a little bit more specifically on what it was about him and the circumstances of the times in which he was involved that made him such a notable leader. I think one of the things that's interesting to start with is the idea that Churchill was a deeply controversial character. Even today, his historical memory is argued over. There are some people who say he was a superlative international statesman, a wonderful leader. There are others who question what he did and the way in which he conducted himself. He was, during his life, very controversial. As one of his closest confidants during the Second World War said, at times you feel like you could kiss his feet, at other times you want to kill him. And this was someone who liked him very much and who was close to him. So it gives you a sense of the fact. And I suppose it's often the case, isn't it, with very, very successful individuals, men or women, whatever their line of work is, those who get to the top are very often deeply controversial characters. One of the things that made Churchill so controversial was the fact he was very egotistical. He had an enormous belief in himself and didn't really like being challenged very much. And of course, as one will understand, that kind of self-centeredness can mean that you're very, very viewed in a different light by different people. The other thing I think that's important to note about Churchill is just the sheer breadth of his achievements. We tend to remember him as a politician and a statesman and a war leader, but he was also hugely successful in other spheres of his life. And even if he hadn't been a politician, we would probably still know about him for other reasons, certainly in the West. What I mean by this is that for much of his life he was the highest paid writer in Britain. He wrote millions and millions of words in books, in journal articles, and in other media. He won a Nobel Prize for English literature, nothing to do with his war leadership or political status. So you've got on your hands here a Nobel Prize-winning literary creator. In other things also, he was the kind of person many people I would certainly envy. He was also a very, very good artist. And during his life, he didn't take it up until he was 40 years old, but he became a watercolour painter. And he painted over 500 canvases, mainly of nice scenes, say the Mediterranean, or famous English houses and things like that. And these paintings were good enough to get exhibited at the Royal Academy anonymously. So he made sure that he wasn't being given privilege because he was Winston Churchill. He would enter things into top exhibitions and get them in. So just the point I'm making is that beyond the statesman figure that we tend to know looking like this, there were many other things in his life where he showed excellence and indeed excelled. And also, as I'll talk a little bit about, he was a family man. This is a man with a wife. His relationship with his wife is hugely important in his success. He's a man with children, not as good a father maybe as he might have been. So there are many, many aspects to Churchill's life. He is, I think, an extraordinary character. That's what I always find about him. Now, the first thing to note, I think, if we're trying to isolate things about Churchill that make him the man that he becomes, he's born into a ruling elite. If you're born into a ruling elite, you usually have a bit of a leg up in life. Churchill is born in a palace, so he isn't someone who came from the streets. He is a man born into privilege. I'm not for a moment saying that didn't mean he had lots of challenges, and that I think there was an extraordinary brilliance about him that marked him out from just about every other leader of the 20th century. But he is born into an elite. He's born in a palace, he goes to public school, and as you know, the English public school system was all about creating men to run the British Empire and become leaders and all the rest of it. So he's born into a position of privilege. And so obviously, he's already on something of a fast track from early in his life. But the other interesting thing about his birth here is that this palace that you're going to visit, and it is, I think that there are only 2 homes in the UK that are bigger than this. It's an enormous place, it's still a private home. It's now, I think, the 14th Duke of Marlborough who lives there. The thing about this place is that it's a monument to victory over the French. Okay, so Blenheim, the name comes from a battle fought against the French in the early 18th century. So the whole palace and the money to build it was given to Churchill's ancestor as a reward for his generalship. You will see, when you go to the palace, when you look across the lake and over the Grand Bridge, you'll see a column, something like Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, nearly as big. And on that monument is John Spencer for Churchill, the 1st Duke of Marlborough. Now, the important thing about this, and Churchill, who was born in this part of the palace, is that Churchill believed that he was born into a bloodline that had an excellence in war and strategy. He was acutely aware from young childhood that his ancestor had been a great military leader. He was surrounded in this palace when he was here by memories and, if you like, trophies of victory. Like I say, the palace itself is basically a massive triumphal shout of victory over the French. In bits of the architecture, you will see English cannonballs crushing the French cock, the cockerel that was the symbol of France. Inside the building, you will see enormous tapestries depicting John Spencer Churchill's victories on battlefields. So Churchill is surrounded by a sense of a family that has been successful in battle. And so from a very, very early age, Churchill believes that he's got something about him. And he believes even more that he has a destiny to fulfill. So these things are quite powerful motivators of a very, very young child going through early adulthood. Now, you'll see that I'm trying to combine 2 things here. What I usually do is I usually give a sort of a tour of Churchill's life. But I wanted, as I say, I wanted to focus more on specific things about him and leadership, okay? So bear with me, the slides aren't going to coordinate so much with what I will talk about. This is his father. One of the things that's important about his family, and again, if you're trying to understand the DNA of Churchill as a leader, his family is very important. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a huge critic of his son. He was very unaffectionate. He was always telling his son that he wasn't good enough, that he risked becoming a social wastrel. Churchill was always trying to please his father and never succeeding. So what you have in the Churchill makeup from very, very early on is this sense that I'm striving to please my father and not achieving it. And then when this man was a very, very senior politician, but a flawed individual who made a big mistake when he resigned from being the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1880s. He died when Churchill was young. He died when Churchill was about 19. So when he dies, Churchill feels that he must take his father's political causes forward. And it's one of the main drives for Churchill to leave the army, which he joins after school, and become a politician. So the relationship with the father and trying to please the father is really important. And similarly with the mother. The mother was a famous society beauty, Jenny Spencer Churchill. It was the kind of period, as you will know, where Victorian children of this kind of class didn't see much of their parents. Churchill had a much closer relationship with his nanny than with his parents. This was the age in which parents of this kind of class were too busy hunting, socialising, travelling the great houses of the country, getting involved in London, life and all the rest of it, to have much time for their children. And it's a period in which children are sent away to school, to boarding school at a very young age. Churchill says of his mother, for me she was like the morning star. I worshipped her from afar. The other important thing to note about his mother, and if you're trying to understand and unpick what it is that makes Churchill tick, is that she's an American. So Winston Churchill is half American, and this is very important. As he once said when addressing both houses of both of the houses of Congress in America. He said, if my father had been born American and my mother had been born British, I might have got here on my own. So this idea that he could have been an American citizen and become an American politician. The important thing about his half-American stature is that during the Second World War, when building an alliance with America to try and defeat Nazism and fascism and all the rest of it, Churchill is in an ideal position. He already knows America. He's visited America. America's on his radar. Bear in mind that at this time, Britain was the world's superpower. America was an up-and-coming power. And many British politicians of Churchill's vintage, if you like, they didn't know much about America. They didn't respect it. They viewed America as an upstart. So people like Neville Chamberlain, Churchill's predecessor as Prime Minister, was in a very, very bad situation to forge a relationship with the American people and the American political leadership. He didn't understand America, didn't really see the point of America. Whereas Churchill, with his background, is very much in the right position to be making a relationship with President Roosevelt, to be appealing to the American people about the need to support the British in Europe against the Germans and the Italians. So the American aspect is I think, very important. The other thing about Churchill's background is that, like many children of his class, again, it's quite military. So as a young boy, he has an army of 1,500 tin soldiers, and will spend a lot of his time arranging infantry here and cavalry there, and having battles, all of that kind of thing that, of course, children, usually boys, but girls sometimes as well, have always enjoyed playing war. Him and his brothers would do things like they would build catapults that would fire apples, and they would attack other kids with these sort of, apple guns. And so lots of sort of military things were a part of the cultural background. And when at school, Churchill joins the Officer Cadet Corps, again, very, very typical for children of that class in that period. So he's got quite a lot of, if you like, military sort of, I suppose, noise going on all around him as a young man, quite apart from the specifics related to birth in Blenheim and the Churchill family name. At school, he isn't a particularly good performer. He's seen as a bit of a naughty child. One of the key things that, it's a classic thing in many ways, one of the things that makes Churchill such a good leader is a quality that also gets him into trouble. So what this is he doesn't take authority very well. He always wants to question authority. Why am I doing algebra? There's no point in algebra, is what he thought as a child. And he's stuck by that belief as an adult. He said, I've never met a quadratic equation since. So this idea that why you teach me things that clearly are of no use. My point is that from a very early age, he challenges authority, it gets him into trouble, but it becomes a key talent as a politician. So when he goes into a new position, for example, say when he becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer, essentially the head of the finance ministry, when he assumes that role, customarily, he would have just taken the advice of the civil servants who are financial experts, the city. He doesn't. He wants to challenge people. He wants experts to tell him exactly why what they want him to do is what he should do. So it always challenges authority. It gets him into lots of trouble. He challenges the leadership of his political party, for instance. He leaves his political party. So one of the things that comes out of school is this desire to always be challenging those above him and to not accept conventions. And as you can see right from the start, it's the kind of thing that makes him unpopular with some people, but is also just the kind of quality that becomes very important when he's Prime Minister trying to fight Adolf Hitler in the war. When all of the politicians around him are saying, we need to do a deal with the Nazis, we can't beat them. Churchill's personality is saying, there's no way we're going to do that, we're going to find a way. We aren't going to accept this situation. Things that he is good at school, this was a young schoolboy, things that become important, if you like, in his leadership portfolio. Whilst he's bad at certain things at school, he discovers that he has a love of history, and throughout the rest of his life, Churchill, first of all, becomes a very notable historian who writes some very important works of history, but he also uses history to mobilise people. So during the war, for instance, he will talk about Britain's struggle against the Nazis in particular, and talk about it in historical terms. He also discovers a love and a skill for language. And clearly this is one of the most important aspects of Churchill's life story, is that he is a consummate communicator. As an American said about his speeches during the Second World War, he mobilised the English language and sent it into battle. So this idea that whether through his speeches, through documents written to political colleagues, through the books or the journal articles that he wrote, he was able to persuade, communicate in all sorts of ways because of his mastery and his love of language. Churchill joins the army after school. This is him at Winchester, at Harrow. So you've probably heard of Harrow. Eton, Winchester and Harrow are the three most famous English public schools to this day. This is Churchill in the uniform of Harrow School in London. He afterwards joins the army. This is him as a young man in a Hussars regiment. What's interesting about this period of his life in particular is, first of all, he begins to display this phenomenal industriousness. So he understands as a young soldier that if he's going to get ahead, he needs to win medals. To win medals, he needs to take part in campaigns. So he will use his mother's contacts and any method he can to get to where the action's happening. In Africa, obviously this high noon of the British Empire, the British are fighting in Africa a lot. They're fighting in what's now the northwest frontier area of Pakistan. Churchill will strive to get to these areas of battle and distinguish himself. He'll try and thrust himself forward so that his superior officers notice how good a soldier he is. And as you can imagine, again, lots of his brother officers don't like this. People don't like someone who seems to be thrusting to get attention. It's very much part of Churchill and his drive to do well and to distinguish himself. But perhaps the more important thing that happens during this time of Churchill's life, he decides he wants to get into politics, decides that garrison life in the British Army is not for him, realises with regret that not having gone to university might present him with a handicap. The kind of young men he'd be competing with to become a member of Parliament, they would have been to Oxford and Cambridge and all of those kinds of things. He hasn't got that. So what he does, he puts himself through a massive program of self-education, which again shows this, what's coming up at this time of his life, when he's this age, 1920, this huge desire and sense of industriousness, this ball of energy, this human dynamo aspect, which becomes a key aspect of Churchill's life from this point on. He has his mother send to him all of the parliamentary records, all of the records of parliamentary speeches. She has her send him all of the great works of political economy, of philosophy, and he begins to just consume all of the great works, the canon of philosophy, politics, economics. So this huge program of self-education that take him then into political life. This is again during the Boer War in 1900, and then he becomes a politician from 1900 onwards. Now, other things that are important at this time of Churchill's life is he has a fascination of things like battlefields, of grand strategy. So when he's a young soldier, he should basically be focusing on the 20 men under his command, looking after their horses and that kind of thing. Churchill is thinking much grander thoughts. He's thinking, I wonder what it would be like to command 10,000 men. I think that I could arrange a formation of 10,000 men. So he's thinking at this higher strategic level, even when he's a young whippersnapper, a junior officer in the British Army. What this does, and he studies an awful lot. And as we all know, study can't get you everywhere. It's a huge advantage. And one of the things one notices about Churchill is that from an early age, from this period, he is reading a lot. He is consuming a great deal of knowledge. And this really puts him in good stead later in his life. He understands about complex military and strategic affairs. He also exhibits a joy and fascination with warfare. He once says to his wife, "It's terrible that I made this way, but I'm just fascinated by war." Doesn't make him a warmonger, although there's often been a criticism leveled against him, but he's fascinated by things, as I said, like how you maneuver large formations. So how do you get thousands of infantrymen to operate with thousands of artillerymen and that kind of thing, tanks and all the rest of it? He also is very interested in technology. He's interested in gun calibers, rifles, how machines work. So he relishes in warfare, although never glorifies it. When we're thinking about Churchill, because so much hyperbole surrounds him, it's easy to forget some basic things about this man. He's a very, very unusual character. He doesn't look like people of his class do. 5'6", 38-inch chest, red hair, balding early. He doesn't look like your classic scion of the British aristocracy. He doesn't sound like it either. His voice is very strange. He is an elemental force of nature. One doesn't meet many people like that. The kind of people that you would never meet Churchill at any stage of his life and not forget and not remember him. He was a remarkably memorable person. There's something about him. He had, for example, a very high capacity for pressurised work and decisiveness in those situations. He took on the task of leading Britain and indeed the Western world in the war with relish, with little sleep, at a time when most men are retiring. So he attains the top job as Prime Minister at the age of 66. He has a very, very powerful personality. He's able to convince people. He's often able to steamroller over people. And again, one can see in that areas of problem as well as attainment and opportunity. He was a remarkably intelligent man. I think often he isn't given quite the credit that's due. In fact, he was actually very brainy. One of the things that was proven at school, which is the kind of thing that you can't train in a business school, you either have it or you haven't. He had a phenomenal memory. Very, very useful thing to have. Once, for example, he recites to his headmaster a 1,200-line poem. So imagine committing 1,200 lines of poetry to memory. So these are the kind of things that make him, that I think distinguish him. Venetia Stanley, a close friend of his, described him thus. I think it really sums up a number of things about Churchill. She said, "He is a wonderful creature." I like the use of the word creature. "He is a wonderful creature with a curious dash of schoolboy simplicity and what someone said of genius, a zigzag streak of lightning through the brain." And I like this description because you do get in Churchill, he is in many ways, even as an old man, there's a lot of big schoolboy about him. He's fascinated by things. Even when he's Prime Minister, he wants to land with the troops when we reinvade Europe. Completely inappropriate for the Prime Minister to do that, but he really wants to be there with the troops when they land. So he has this schoolboy aspect to him, and I like this idea, this description of genius, a zigzag streak of lightning in the brain. In terms of his leadership style, the kind of things that made him the leader that he became, someone wrote this: "His use of language was designed to stimulate rather than sedate. He wanted to quicken things up rather than slow them down. And most tellingly, Churchill wanted to resolve issues rather than simply manage them. So whatever the problem was, he wanted to grasp it and sort it out, not just manage it away, push it to one side." Now this reflected a deep impetuosity in his nature. Churchill was a very impatient man. And as you can appreciate, sometimes in leadership of whatever stripe, particularly in political leadership, being patient and doing nothing is just the right thing to do. Churchill was very bad at that. He wanted immediately to get up, close with the enemy, be it a problem or be it a physical enemy, and deal with it there and then. And that's part of the drive that he brought to leadership in the Second World War, when there was no one else around him capable of doing that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that so long, because I think it's a point that's easy to overlook, particularly if you aren't familiar, if you like, with the Western canon of Churchill assessments, both negative and positive. I'll return to that in a bit. So Churchill admires intensity of purpose and action. It often leads him to make bad choices about those around him as subordinates. So, for example, if you were a military officer who was full of dash and presence, then Churchill would probably like you very much. Churchill was quite naive judging other people. But if you were a more taciturn officer, if you weren't gung-ho, Churchill would be apt to overlook you. So again, one can see plenty of elements within Churchill. I mean, I think the good thing about Churchill is a massively flawed human being. He's a hugely complex human being from a dysfunctional family. But he's also a remarkably talented individual whose achievements speak for themselves. And that's the fascination. You've got no two-dimensional wooden character here. You've got everything going on with Churchill. So the defining feature of Churchill's career is a determination to confront rather than evade challenges. And one of the interesting things about this from a leadership point of view is that this led to some remarkable transformations of position in the course of an engagement. What I mean by this is that Churchill was happy to change his mind. And that isn't usual in politicians, certainly in our country. If you're a politician, you're supposed to act as if you've always known that what you were saying was the right thing to be doing. Churchill was very apt to say, the situation's changed. I've seen, Churchill says, a man who doesn't change his opinions with new evidence is no use. So Churchill was more than happy to make U-turns and say, right, I used to think that, but evidence has shown me that the opposite is the case, and I'm going to change my position. It makes him an unpopular politician in many people's eyes. So in terms of qualities, many of his leadership traits were products of his complex personality. This is with his wife. He marries at Blenheim. At the back of Blenheim there's a small temple in the garden near the Rose Garden. And this is where he proposed in 1908 to Clementine Hosier. The important thing about this, they are then married from 1908 until Churchill's death in 1965. The important thing in Churchill's life that she brings is she has, in many cases, better political judgment than he has. She understands that he's married to politics and his career as much as he is to her, and therefore is able to perform a role of being a perfect, if you like, politician's wife. And certainly as Churchill becomes more senior and more powerful, she is really the only person who is able to calm him down and sometimes discipline him. And for instance, when he's under huge pressure, leading a nation and a lot of the world in a war of epic proportions, she is able to tell Churchill if he's being a bully to colleagues. When his impatience is getting the better of him, she is very, very good at just saying, just calm down, just slow down, don't act too soon, don't be precipitate. So the role that she plays in his life is hugely important, as well as providing a life partnership that is very, very endearing. If you are interested in these things, there's a wonderful series of letters exchanged between the two of them throughout their marriage. And there's a great deal of affection and respect between them. And just their story is a very, very interesting one. So in terms of his qualities, he's intuitive, he's romantic, he's emotional. Unusually for a man of his station, in his time, he would very often shed tears in public. He's brave, he's inventive, he's enthusiastic, he's industrious, he's hedonistic. This is a man who likes his champagne and cigars. Nothing but the best is always good enough for Churchill. He is not someone who is going to scrimp and save. He is very unself-conscious. He is risk-taking. He's a risk-taker. He's determined, witty, and sociable. He's also ruthless. All of these, these are all very, very different things, but as you will know, in anyone's complex personality, all of these things can be present, and they certainly are with him. It's like a kaleidoscope of different qualities and traits that we see in this man. He's selfish, but he also has very strong streaks of decency, of humanity, and courage. These are all parts of the ingredients that make up this very, very unusual man. And I also think it's worth, because we tend to think about Churchill as a war leader, as an international politician, the person most able to judge, I think, was the man who worked with him as his deputy prime minister during the war. This was Clement Attlee, who was leader of the Labour Party during the war, and was Churchill's successor as prime minister when the British electorate defeat Churchill's government in 1945. Attlee said that his most overlooked, but his most important characteristic was compassion. And we very, very rarely put compassion together with an assessment of Churchill. As Attlee said, his compassion coupled with his energy was what made him so dynamic. Cruelty and injustice revolted him. On the other hand, what Attlee thought to be his greatest weakness was his impatience. There are other things that are very important if we're trying to get in touch with Churchill as a leader and the man that he becomes in his public life. As I mentioned, he's hugely egotistical. Someone once said that talking to Churchill could be like talking to a brass band. Essentially, you don't get a chance to say anything, you just listen to the noise of Churchill blowing across you. This was partly because of his background. Again, Attlee said, I think that Churchill thought he was superior to anyone he had ever met, bar Lloyd George, who was his political colleague early in his career. And as you can imagine, that would annoy lots of people. Senior politicians and military people around you, your peers, if you think you're God, you've got some God-given right, it's going to annoy people. But what it also meant was that Churchill, certainly during the war, believed in summit diplomacy. He believed that only he could sort out problems. He couldn't delegate. So he wouldn't send his foreign minister to deal with Roosevelt or Stalin or Chiang Kai-shek. He would want to go himself. If I'm there, I can sort this out. I have all of the strings in my hand. I need to be the one. This is him on one of the numerous summit meetings. He pioneered summitry. So during the war, he spends months and months and months, either in the White House, in Cairo, in Tehran, visiting military commanders and the leaders of the other allies. This is a typical meeting where you have Madame Chiang, Churchill, President Roosevelt, and Chiang Kai-shek at one of the head of the Allied government's meetings. What we also have with Churchill, and again this is an undeniably very important trait, is he is very, very resilient. He can take any amount of punishment. And there are plenty of examples I could give when witnesses around him have given a good sense when he's receiving. You've got to bear in mind, for the early part of the Second World War, we were losing everything. The French were defeated, we were nearly defeated, we couldn't seem to win a single battle. Then when the Japanese begin their whirlwind of invasion, they defeat the Dutch, the French, the British, the Americans, everyone. So for the first half of the war, the most you think you can do is staunch the flow of the enemy. You've no idea how you're going to beat them. So you get military disaster upon military disaster. The fall of Tobruk, the fall of Singapore, all of these things. it took an awful lot for Churchill, as the man holding responsibility, to be able to sleep at night, which he was able to do, to be able to present to his commanders and his colleagues and the British people a sense of confidence that ultimately we will win. These things took just unbelievable reservoirs of personal resilience, and then to be taking the most challenging decisions. So, do you allow that convoy to be sunk so that the enemy don't know your source of intelligence? Essentially, are you going to condemn those 5,000 people to die tonight? Take the decision. That kind of thing. Are you going to send extra fighter planes to France to save them? Or do you think that France is doomed and so you must keep the fighters in Britain? Are you going to send resources to support Singapore and Malaya against the Japanese? Or do you think that sending supplies to Russia and Stalin is strategically more important? Those kinds of calls. People will die today because of those kinds of decisions. So taking those kinds of decisions and being the sole person responsible for them on a 24/7 basis for 6 years, I submit to take some resilience. Also, it brings into play this thing like this physical bravery. He's a remarkably brave man. And again, I point to the fact that, look at him. This is during the war. He's not a young man. He even has strokes during the war. He has pneumonia during the war. And yet at any point he is ready to get on a plane or get on a warship and travel across U-boat-infested seas in often very, very uncomfortable situations to meet with his commanders and the leaders of the other Allied nations.
Pictures haven't been able to look at, just
It's also worth bearing in mind that Churchill remains as leader of his political party into his 80s. So, I know in China we tend to be more used to elderly statesmen, but certainly in the West these days there's a focus on, if you've got greying hair and you're over 50, it does seem to be that your chances of senior office are diminishing all the time. We live in a young person's age. This was a man who in his 80s could still defeat his political rivals to cling on to the leadership of his political party and indeed the prime ministership of his country. So another thing that's very important is, and it's really, I think I've covered it, is this fact, those around him say that it's his strength of will that is hugely important. It was his ability to inspire those around him and give them confidence. Because obviously the Second War was not a normal period. Certainly from the point of view of this country and many other countries, China and Hong Kong and places like that will know all about this. These were periods in which people were going to be taken over and occupied by enemies. If we had lost the Battle of Britain, we would have been taken over by the Germans. I would now be speaking German. It was that important. And to be able to inspire people and lead them when you have a total war situation is obviously something that fortunately few are ever called upon to perform. Now, in terms of what Churchill did during the war precisely that made him so important, this is what I think. What he did, particularly in democracies, there has been historically a major conundrum in war, and that is the relationship between the civil leadership and the military leadership. So in the First World War, that led to nearly 1 million deaths of British servicemen alone. For too much of the war, we had allowed the senior admirals and generals to run the war, and the democratically elected civilian government hadn't been able to control them or known how to control them. Churchill had experienced this. He had been a High Minister during that First World War. He began the war leading the Royal Navy, at the time the most powerful military force in the world. He ends the war running the Ministry of Munitions, responsible for arming a vast imperial military force. And what he had seen is he had seen how the government that he was a part of was unable to control the generals and the admirals, and to connect military affairs with broader strategy, things like domestic production of arms as well as feeding people and all those kinds of things. So what Churchill did is he cracked this conundrum in the Second World War of building a machine in which the civilian leadership had the upper hand, as is appropriate in a democratically elected democracy. So as soon as he becomes Prime Minister, he also makes himself Minister of Defence. So essentially, rather like in the American system where the President is Commander-in-Chief, he ensured that in him you have the ultimate authority. So he was able to do that, but then he was able to build in a system so that the senior generals and admirals and airmen were able to work in Whitehall, in the political heart of the British system, in a productive way alongside their civilian counterparts. So that for me is the key thing that he did, is he built a war machine that was appropriate to a democracy in the middle of the 20th century, that harnessed military leadership with civilian leadership. He also built a system, I mean, it's often said, if Hitler had had the kind of system we had, he would have won the war much earlier. But Hitler didn't have. Hitler was a genuine dictator and would ride roughshod over anyone's advice. The good thing about the system that Churchill forged, by accident as well as design, was that he got around him a team of people who were prepared to challenge him when he was, if you like, at his most forceful. So if Churchill thought he had a great idea and start banging the table and asking, why won't we do this, they were happy to go eyeball to eyeball with him. Say, no, Prime Minister, no, you can't do that. We will resign if you do that. So you've got this system of checks and balances with the Chiefs of Staff Committee, with Churchill and his office, that meant that essentially British strategy and the decisions that were made was overall very, very good. Churchill was the kind of person, lots of bad ideas, as well as lots of good ideas, because he was such an ideas person. Some of them needed to be pushed aside or ignored. Thank you, Prime Minister, brilliant idea. We're never going to do it, don't worry, that kind of thing. So it's forging this military-civilian relationship that's all important. And the fact, beyond that, of Churchill's phenomenal energy. Someone at the time said that it was like a dynamo plugged into a Christmas tree. So you've got this war machine, suddenly Churchill comes along, plugs into it, and the whole thing just lit up. Suddenly everything was getting done. Things were moving. Decisions were being made. And the whole feeling and spirit that goes with that sense of resolution, that you actually have a plan, you can win, you are going forward. Even, as for much of the early war, when Churchill didn't have a plan, didn't know how we were going to win, convincing people that there was a plan, that ultimate victory was going to happen, was all important. So that for me is one of the specific things that Churchill did. So rather than us just thinking about Churchill because he's quite famous, we need to look at what specifically it was that he did that other people probably couldn't have done. And the second thing that he did, just as important, it's the key moment at which he becomes Prime Minister in May 1940. Right, May 1940, France falls. So our entire strategy for fighting the Germans had been based upon fighting in alliance with the French. The British Navy and the French Army were the two things that were going to stop the Germans winning the war. Almost as soon as the war starts, the French are defeated. So your ally is gone. The fundamental underpinning of your strategy lies in tatters. At that moment, Churchill is the only person who, with confidence and relish, said, here I am the war leader you're looking for. He goes right back to his days at Lenin. He famously says when he is made Prime Minister, when he goes to see the King and the King formally asks him to become Prime Minister, he said, I felt like I was walking with destiny. So whilst all the other politicians were saying, Jesus Christ, I'd like to be a peacetime Prime Minister, but a wartime Prime Minister when we don't know how we're going to win, I don't want to do that. So all of the opposition or if you like, to Churchill becoming Prime Minister, just wilted away. They didn't have the stomach for the fight. Whereas you have this particular individual, and his whole trajectory of life, his very birth, has convinced him that this is the moment he's been waiting for. That's very lucky that that happened. And why this is particularly important is because at that point, when France has fallen, and there is no idea of how we can stop the Germans winning, and we fear that they are about to invade us, is that the other candidates for the leadership would almost certainly have done a deal with Hitler. It was at a point when they said, look, let's just do a deal with Hitler. Hitler's offering a deal. Hitler's saying, look, Britain, my fight isn't with you. Let me have Europe, and let's just leave it like that. You keep your empire. Now, Churchill knew that the kind of person he was dealing with in Hitler would never stand by those kinds of pledges. That Hitler was going for world domination. Later on, of course, soon after, joined by Mussolini and fascist Italy. Later on, of course, by the Japanese. So Churchill was never going to make a deal. And also, very importantly, he was all the time signalling to America. America obviously doesn't come into the war until the attack by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. But all the time he's signalling to America, saying, support us, give us weapons, help supply us. We know you're not going to fight, but just help support us, we will fight the Germans, we will carry on, we have the resolve. And that signalling is hugely important. So, for example, in early 41, the Americans passed the Lend-Lease Bill, which essentially means that the British can have access to any arms they want and pay for them later. Hugely important American war manoeuvre long before they become belligerents, actually fighting on the ground against the Nazis and all the rest of it. So that moment when Churchill becomes Prime Minister and not doing a deal with the Germans is another hugely important aspect. And what specifically he did, which I think that no matter how much one criticises Churchill's reputation or seeks to denigrate it, that will always stand out as being a very, very concrete, tangible sort of reason for his great significance. So, Churchill, of course, this is Churchill after the war. Churchill is defeated in the 1945 election, remains a politician, and of course very much gets back into his writing. And this is another sphere in which Churchill's power is still palpable today. So Churchill begins to write a big multi-volume history of the Second World War. And part of the reason for this, he says, I'm going to set down the war as I saw it, and I'm going to sort of, if you like, influence how people remember the war thereafter. And you can certainly say in the case of the UK that we still remember the war in the way that Churchill intended us to. And lots of historians have recently had fun sort of unpicking Churchill's view of the war from what actually happened and trying to challenge the Churchillian perspective. This is late in his life. As you can imagine, someone like Churchill doesn't retire very well. A man who had been so used to actions being at the centre of affairs doesn't welcome extra time to stroke his cat and get on with his painting. So he really, really doesn't enjoy his retirement, but lives to a grand old age. He lives until he is 90 years old. This is a scene from his funeral in 1965. This is people queuing in Hyde Park to walk past his catafalque and coffin, which laid in state in the Houses of Parliament. This is the coffin being taken from Westminster Palace, and then the coffin is put onto the Thames. It's taken by barge to Waterloo Station, put on a train, and then begins a long journey, slow journey back to Oxfordshire. And Churchill is then buried in the family plot, which is at the back of Blenheim Palace. So there's a village. If you go to the back of the palace, you'll see in the distance a little church, and that's where Churchill is buried, later on joined by his wife in the family plot, and now by his children. and his parents. So in many ways, Churchill's life comes full circle. He's born in Birmingham, he's born in Oxfordshire, and he returns in death to this area of his birth. Now I'm going to leave it there and see if there are any questions that anyone has, or if there are any aspects of his life you'd like to talk more about. Difficult, there's only two of you. I'm including you. Any questions about Lennon or family? No? Well, it's very early doors, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We can,
Thank you for the presentation.
It is difficult when you're a small group, I understand. So.
yeah. Sorry, and not everyone here, which is thank you so much for everything.
Thank you.
We were guided tour as well, so we just
Yeah, so you've got half